Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Miller. Welcome to Free Yourself, where we explore what it means to flourish through scent, story, and self-discovery. Today's guest is someone whose work has meant a lot to me, both personally and professionally, Dr. Rachel Herz. She's one of the world's foremost experts on the psychology of smell. She's a neuroscientist, a TED speaker, the author of several books, including The Scent of Desire. This was a foundational resource in my capstone project at Penn on fragrance for good. In this conversation, we talk about why smell is an emotionally powerful sense. Rachel breaks down the science behind how scent is processed in the brain, and what happens if and when we lose it, and how it connects so deeply to our memories, our emotions, and identities. We talk about scent training, the future of fragrance in digital spaces, and how this often overlooked sense can be a powerful tool for healing, storytelling, and flourishing. Yes, let's get right into it. First of all, I have to say, to have Dr. Rachel Herz here is really a trip, because in getting my my graduate degree at Penn, which is a Master of Applied Positive Psychology, we have to write a capstone. And for those who might not know, a capstone, I call it like a mini dissertation kind of thing. And my capstone was on fragrance for good. And your research, your work was really so central to my capstone. It was, so I have you have so many research papers, and of course I use a lot of those, but I have your book here as well. And funny enough, I really loved this book because you had it as and we'll talk about it, but The Scent Keeper, you had it
Yeah.
as a 2023 favorite. And the
Mhm.
reason I wanted to bring it up is because, I touched on narrative a little bit, and I thought, well, it's so funny that this is so much about narrative and it's on your favorites, and narrative might not be in your expertise, your wheelhouse, but yet scent and fragrance seems to be so much about narrative on some level. So I kind of wanted you to, I thought we could even just start there in reverse and just hear your thoughts on what you feel about that statement.
Well, so first of all, just with respect to the book, The Scent Keeper. So I was floored. So this is Erica Bauermeister. It was the first thing that I'd ever read by her. I then subsequently read like all her other books because I was so amazed that someone who was not an olfaction scientist and someone who I had not come across before had such an amazing capability of describing scent experiences, and the vocabulary that she used and the way that she was able to sort of quote unquote paint a picture of
Mhm.
smell and the depth that she gave it from the point of view of the narrative, the emotion, the context, the sort of meaning that she wove through it was so incredible that I was just like, oh my God. And I actually got in touch with her as a function of reading that book, and just really amazed by that. So even though, from my perspective, not being a narratician, if that's the is that the word that might be called, someone who studies narrative, or a semiotics person, or in any case, someone who really understands like narrative storytelling, which I am not. I am a storyteller myself when I write popular science books, and I really was able to appreciate and adored how she used scent in this way that I have not ever personally been able to do, or even try to do, because I had not thought about it being used in this format. So I think that certainly scent can be narrative, but I see it as somewhat different. I think I see it much more like fabric, and it is like the whole essence around our experience all the time. And I say this because people who've lost their sense of smell, and I have been told this is one of my best compliments, that as a smelling capable person, I seem, according to people who've lost their sense of smell, really to be able to understand what their experience of lack of smell. And this is for people who have what's called acquired anosmia. So they used to be able to smell, now they can't smell. And it's quite different for people who are born without a sense of smell, because they have a quite different lived experience than people who had and then lost. But that for people who have had and lost, I seem to really be able to get it. And unfortunately, I also briefly had a smell loss during COVID, but that was very recent. And this I was told before that. But what I think is really incredible about smell loss for people who had it is their experience of living life behind a pane of glass. Like they can't really connect not just with others but also with the world and even with themselves. There's like this disconnect in the fabric of reality, I suppose I would put it that way, which is the way that I see smell as an invisible force, an invisible sensory experience, as being this sort of connectome almost of our inner and outer states and with each other as well as even with ourselves.
Well, I'm going to go somewhere. I want to just, I had that I wrote, um, this was just in my notes and I'd shared this with you, but fragrance as the whole story, scent, the emotional experience of it, and accord, the motive or symbolic theme within the story. And I think that that's really kind of how I experience the connection to express scent, my relationship. I kind of feel as an actor, as a writer, as a creator, that's how I kind of live my life experience, right? My relationships with people through that kind of story. So when you're talking about um as fabric, fabric makes up a garment, fabric makes up a story in some kind of a way. And I feel like it's so important that, I think it'd be really great to hear you talk about the privileged connection that scent has to our emotional memory and scent, and kind of to jump there for our audience so you can really hear about the primordial connection that scent has for us to the limbic system and what that means. Um, because I really, this loss of scent also equals the gain of it could mean the regaining of scent. It also means the gaining of the understanding of the value of it,
Mhm, mhm,
right?
mhm.
And there are a lot of connections. When we lose something, we ultimately also gain something. And I think through that discussion, we can really hear about the value of scent and not just what someone has lost, but the understanding that they've gained to that as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start at the beginning, which was your comment about the privileged and unique connection between smell and emotion and memory. And basically, it is fundamentally due to neuroanatomy, the part of the brain which is in the limbic system that is what is processing our conscious perception of sense. So when I smell a rose and I go, rose as a sensory experience, the part of the brain that is governing that experience is the amygdala hippocampal complex. And that is the structure of the amygdala, which is involved in emotional experience, and the hippocampus, which is involved in various forms of associative learning and memory. And they are connected structures, and together they make what is called the primary olfactory cortex. So every sensory system has a primary part of the brain. So there's the primary visual cortex, which is the back of the head. There's the primary taste cortex, there's the primary auditory cortex, and so forth. And the primary smell cortex is this conjoined region. Now, what's really critical here is that the amygdala, as you know, is doing something else. It is processing emotion, it is processing emotional memory, and that is what its sort of main job is, so to speak, in other terms. And the hippocampus, its main job is various forms of memory, spatial navigation, and so forth. And so you have these structures which are doing other work. And at the same time, they are processing our conscious perception of scent. And that's what gives smell its really, really unique connection to the experience of emotion, this sort of visceral experience of emotion and evocativeness, and its connection to being able to pull up memories from our past lives that we may have actually completely forgotten that we even experienced this episode. And smell has the capability to sort of bring that up and bring it to us in a way which is much more emotionally evocative and intense than having the same recollection, which might come to us through hearing something, reading something, seeing something, even taste per se, as opposed to smell. But so yeah, so there's this very specific neuroanatomy that is behind this unique connection with smell and emotion and memory. And so that really gives it this particular privileged and unique aspect to our existence. And in terms of what you said about loss and gain, so I definitely so I've thought about, how do we make people really care about their sense of smell? Well, if they could like temporarily lose it and then realize, because it's one thing to say, well, I mean, people can sort of think about, oh, well, food, I realize that has connection to aroma. And if you explain what flavor is, really just taste is salt, sour, sweet, and bitter. And so chocolate is just sweet, maybe a little bitter, plus all the aromatics. Bacon is just salt and then 150 different volatile organic compounds that make up the aroma of bacon. So people can kind of get that. They can get, oh, well, I wouldn't be able to smell the gas leak, that kind of stuff. But actually, it is connected to literally everything from our personal life, our intimate life, our sense of self, our spatial capabilities, our cognitive capabilities, even our mortality. People who have lost their sense of smell that are over the age of 55 are 4 times more likely to die within a 5-year period than people with a fully functioning sense of smell. And this is like with everything else held constant, comparing across peers. So it is really, really connected to every aspect of our existence. And even from the point of view of just daily life experiences and realizing it's not just food and fire, if you could lose your sense of smell for like a week, you might realize how valuable it is and how connected it is to everything, and how you're like suddenly behind a pane of glass and now you're through the glass and can touch and connect and sort of experience life fully. And that if you could give someone that little brief moment, then they would understand the value. Now, in terms of when you say like every loss can also be a gain, a window closes or door opens, that kind of idea, I do feel, and people even talk about living, for instance, people who live with chronic pain, the things that they can learn from dealing with that adversity and so forth. And certainly people who deal with adversity in their daily life have a greater understanding of a variety of things than people who don't have to confront those challenges. But I would say that there is truly a loss that cannot be replaced through another sensory system that without smell you just don't have. I mean, you can have your memory up to a certain point, but over time I've worked with people who initially after smell loss, they used to feel like they could sort of recreate in their mind's nose, as it were, like, oh, I remember what, Thanksgiving smelled like, and makes me still feel connected to my family. But that now, 20 years later, they've lost that ability even to sort of feel that conjured sense of smell, which I personally don't think they're really getting in the first place, but at least their memory is like more connected to the event. And then if they, as time goes by and that's no longer available to them, then they lose that even further. And it is such a distressing state for people. I mean, it doesn't have to be. Not everybody falls into like feeling that this is, a tremendous loss, but many people do. And unfortunately, because of the effects of time, both on neuroanatomy and on just personal lived experience, it often gets worse rather than better. So people don't necessarily accommodate, like losing vision, actually, people accommodate to being blind much better than they do to losing their sense of smell if it's permanent.
Yeah, yeah, my gosh, I'm so amazed and tripping out here that we are talking. And, so my what's so important, and love positive psychology so much, and Marty Seligman, and that it's about human flourishing, it's about individual flourishing and collective flourishing, right? And my question, even it was really an incomplete question, so I love that you really kind of just called out, you highlighted how significantly important and valuable our sense of smell is. I have felt as though in all my research and all the discussions and in all the scholars that I just think are so incredible, amazing, amazing people, scent is really not talked about. It's, even in the research on writing my capstone, it's not there. And so, and asking about what's lost and that something's gained, it's that we're gaining information from people who are actually can share their experience of how their emotional personal experience of how valuable it is. And I kind of was not being sensitive to their loss as much as opposed to us all gaining an understanding that it is core. It's our most primal experience. It is something that we. So I'd love for you to talk about that, and I'd also love to kind of talk about that. everybody experiences scent differently. So whether you're experiencing a rose differently, we all might look at a rose in relatively the same way, but everybody's good scent is not the next person's good scent. Um, uh, that the other thing that I would love for you to talk about, and I think is so important, is about the possibility of regaining or increasing or building our sense of smell to help build our wellness and our collective well-being as a society, the different ways that we can do that.
One of the things that I think in terms of my personal career and theoretical enlightenment, et cetera, that I feel like for me is one of my favorite self-discoveries, as it were, and the world of smell, is realizing that smell and emotion are fundamentally the same in that the experience for humans. So the experience, having emotions is for survival. So positive emotions lead us to go forth towards things that are good for us and ultimately, multiply, as it were, love and companionship and romance, etc. And negative emotions are to keep us alive. So whether it be disgust at, the potential for contamination or poison, or fear or anger, like these are all emotions which help us combat or escape from dangers. And not only from the point of view of the neuroanatomy being fundamentally the same with smell and emotion, that is the amygdala, but it is also the case that what the fundamental essence of information that smell gives us is about approach and avoid. So even if it's just like a mild hedonic, I like that, it is about going towards. And if it's a like, I don't really like that, it's about going away from. And in other animals who actually use their sense of smell as the primary mode of communication and data acquisition for their worlds, we actually pretty much use vision as bipedal primates. Were very visually oriented from the point of view of what is the data, well, how am I going to use this, and what does that mean from the world around me. But the information that we are getting is still fundamentally connected to our survival. It is about what is good out there and what is bad, and I should retreat from it. Now, this also brings up very interestingly your comment about, not everybody's sort of likes and dislikes being relatively different, or at least somewhat different depending upon what it is. And you might say, well, doesn't make sense from a survival perspective, because wouldn't it be right that we all, the smell of things that are poisonous would be bad and the smell of things that would be good, for us are good. But the issue here has to do with the fact that the type of species that we are. And we are what are known as generalists. And that means that we can exploit any habitat on the planet as our home. And wherever we end up, we find what is food and what is dangerous and so on. Now, this is contrasted with animals who are specialists that are only living in one particular ecological niche. A specific kind of thing is what they eat. Koala bears are an example of an extreme version of this, and that they may have just very, very particular predators. So animals that are specialists are actually born innately knowing the smell of their predators and the smell of what will be their food sources. But we as generalists are not. Rather, we are built to learn very quickly, like on one trial, what is good and what is bad based
Hmm.
on the circumstance that we find ourselves in. Now, that is where the meaning association comes into play. And that is based, in our current world on, personal experience with whatever it might be. It's also very much interwoven with culture, different cultures. This is very obviously seen with food. One man's meat is another man's poison. For instance, cheese in Asia is disgusting. In Europe and North America, it's a delicacy typically. Anyway, there are many, many examples of this. One of my favorites is wintergreen, a scent that is despised in the UK because its connection is with medicine or with toilet cleaning products. And in the
Hmm.
US, it's candy and gum. So paired with sweet. So in any event, there's all this culture, there's all this personal experience, but there's also genetics. And what's also really interesting about the sense of smell is that we all have a unique nose. And what I mean by that is that the specific receptors that are expressed in our nose that are doing the detecting of the various volatile organic compounds that we're coming in contact with is ever so slightly different. That array is ever so slightly different across every different person unless you have an identical twin. And what that means is that the number of receptors that I have and the specific types will mean that I perceive chemicals in somewhat different ways, more intense, less intense. I can't really perceive it at all, or I can perceive it extremely strongly. I perceive it in one way, or if I have a different version of that particular neuron, I perceive it in another way. So there is this interaction between the genetics of every one of us, the subjective experience of every single one of us, and the culture in which we find ourselves and the particular learnings that we've had within it. So it's pretty complicated. And you can get like sort of basics and make sort of generalizations, usually based on culture, that you can sort of say, and especially also advertising goes a long way with this. So if a product, was launched at a certain period of time and everyone like Jergens, or sorry, Johnson and Johnson's baby powder,
Mhm.
that is the smell of baby powder because that was what was on the market and that was, what was available and that was baby powder. So, we can have a kind of a culturally specific knowledge about that, but so many other things are really idiosyncratic and not like that, that we then come to it in our own different way. And because language is so differently and non-explicitly connected to smell, what I may say, oh, I can smell a swimming pool. And you may say, oh, I smell bleach. And we're both talking about chlorine, but we have different language to say what we're experiencing. And it actually also might be different the way we're actually perceiving it for each of us, unlike, for instance, seeing a rose. And not only that, based on my associations, like I could say, I love the smell of swimming pools, swimming pool, fun, childhood, etc. And you could be like bleach, horrible, cleaning up big messes and so forth. So just examples.
This is so basically we're really it is less molecular, it is more emotional, is our relationship. And if that's the case, then are we able to rescript our experience with a smell or a scent, so that it leans more positive for us when we want it to? Because you're talking about that certain scents. It's great. That meat is rotten. You don't want to eat that. Okay, we got that. But certainly ones that we can kind of adjust in more of a positive experience for us.
So I don't want to say that it's not at all molecular because, like I said, the genetics of our receptors and so forth, that is something that comes into play. But yes, it is much more about acquired meaning, and also the context in which we are experiencing this scent can dictate how we interpret it. So let's just say that I'm in a restaurant and some waiter walks by with a tray, and I go, that must be the cheese plate going by, and I'm like mouth watering and so on. Or I could be walking in an alley behind a dive bar and smell something very similar and go, disgusting vomit, whatever the case might be. So context actually for imposing the meaning that we then interpret is also super important. But what you're saying about sort of like reprogramming ourselves or rewiring ourselves. So um, generally speaking, the answer is yes, but let me explain a little bit further. So if you've never smelled a smell before, then immediately upon experiencing it, that's what you're doing. You're associating, this new fragrance, for instance, with a vacation. And now this fragrance is going to be the special vacation because I only wore it while I was on this vacation. Now, when I want to get like memory in a bottle, I open up the scent and then get transported back to Hawaii, for example. Um, the other thing, though, which is a lot more difficult, is let's say a common scent like a barbecue, for example, is something that I've learned to like because I go to barbecues and it's a fun time and it's food and so on. And then I end up, I'm a soldier and I end up in a combat situation where there have been all kinds of civilian casualties with fire. And it turns out that the smell of human flesh is very much the same as the smell of other animal flesh that we eat. And now that scent has become completely horrendous and can actually trigger a post-traumatic stress disorder response in me when I return home. So combat veterans often have the smell being a trigger for PTSD, and it can be really difficult. And I've worked with clinicians who have had patients like this on what can be done. This is like a common smell that the person could be like walking down the street, someone could be cooking out in their backyard. They can't necessarily protect themselves from it, and or they want to engage in socializing again, as they used to, and how can they overcome not being able to go to cookouts, for example. And this then ties back into emotion and emotional significance. And what this is uh, having to do with is that negative emotions are much more important for us and our survival. So, like, the tiger is going to kill you, the fire is going to consume you. The daisy, that's nice, but, nothing immediately, connected to positivity is necessarily happening from that. So, when we learn an association with a smell through a negative connection emotionally, it's much harder to undo and reassociate than if it were something positive. So, and also, generally speaking, the first association we make to a smell is the one that becomes the meaning of the smell. So there's that in the first place. It's hard anyway to sort of replace it with something else. But especially if it is something which, even if it was positive, now it becomes negative. The negative overwhelms what it originally was, and it's really hard to disconnect. It's not impossible, but it is a lot more difficult to disconnect that and then make the scent of barbecues positive again. So it can be done. It's a much longer and more complicated process. It's also much more difficult than, for instance, if there were a visual trigger, and how you would help someone who had a visual trigger for a PTSD episode compared to a scent trigger. So there's all kinds of issues with smell, especially for PTSD, that make it more complicated, but it's not impossible.
I'm going to ask. I am not a clinician, and so I just want to put that out there. But this intrigues me so much, and I do want to bring us to being able to regain our sense of smell or whatnot. But based on what you're saying, I would think, and there's no science behind this, is just me putting this together, that if one was able to actually make this adjustment, because it is a deeper, uh, it is more challenging, it is often more deeply rooted, it is more emotionally connected. But if one is actually able to adjust one's relationship with how they perceive that, how they experience that smell, that scent, that the rewards might be bigger than a visual uh, award or reward or something like that. Would that is that something I that could be true?
Well, I definitely would agree that because of the emotional bang for one's buck that one gets with smell, because it is uniquely connected to our experience of emotion. In fact, emotion is the first experience we have with smell, even if I said before, like just even liking, disliking, that it is more powerful and more intense than a visual experience or an auditory experience. And I have done research to show that the emotional associations are more intense with smell than other types of sensory experiences. So to your answer, the answer is basically yes. So there is a bigger impact, but that is also why it can be such a potently negative cue for someone who has a very negative connection to that smell, for what that means. And so it is both like the highest high possibly, but it can also be the lowest low.
Um, I want to uh, bring you to maybe talking a little bit about social environments and whatnot when it comes to smell and scent. But I, COVID? A lot of people. My understanding is that the one place where the neurons do uh, regenerate is our sense of smell, and it's one of our only senses that actually happens. And so, therefore, the ability to regain our sense of smell is definitely bigger, better, more available than the loss of one of our other senses.
So that's true, but it has to do with how our sense of smell is lost, and also sort of underlying factors. So, for example, viral infections. So prior to COVID, there were other viral infections that cause people to lose their sense of smell. And in general, things that are viral tend to have a better prognosis than things that are traumatic. So, for what I mean by that is that if you have a head injury from a car accident or a sports accident or injury, and you have been hit at the top of your forehead like this or at the back of
Mm.
your head like this, and it moves this bone, which is basically separating, it says like on a horizontal plane, um, your brain from below your brain. And where this is really critical is the sensory neurons for smell are going from literally outside the brain to
Mhm.
inside the brain through this bone. If that
Amazing.
bone gets jarred, it shears off the axons of those receptors. And not necessarily, but often, especially if it's an injury, what happens is that inflammation occurs, and this bone, which has all these tiny holes, scars over, and those little holes close over. And so even though the axons can regenerate from this side, they can never get back up in because that bone has scarred over. So that's typically where we see permanent smell losses in these traumatic injuries. Now, on the other hand, and COVID is a really good example of this, and long COVID in particular, where you see this long-term inflammation. It's a different type of issue that's going on here, but again, inflammation kind of being at the root, is so the problem with COVID and smell is that it wasn't actually affecting the sensory neurons themselves per se. Where the virus actually was causing the damage to our sense of smell was in the layer just below where the neurons are sticking out, and to the supporting cells and to the basal cells, so basically the stem cells that will be the ones that turn into new sensory neurons when they get their chance. And generally speaking, if we're healthy and our sense of smell is working completely fine, we're in fact regenerating our sensory neurons for smell all the time. So like
Mm.
pretty much, this is like a little bit of a loose statement, but pretty much once a month we get a new nose. So this is where those stem cells, the basal cells, come into play.
That's
But what
exciting.
it is, it is. But what happens is when people have had this sort of long COVID problem, and with smell in particular, is this long-term inflammation at that layer of where the sensory neurons would be regenerating, and also what's keeping the ones that are even there healthy and functioning is impaired, so that you don't get the regeneration, and you also have this inflammation which causes the non-optimal firing of or working of the ones that are in fact there in the first place. So that's why the loss is immediate, and then why people can't regain it is because of this long-term inflammation. So that's, where that can be an issue. Now, smell training, which is the most innocuous method and also probably the most effective method currently that at least we know of from research that is out there that's legitimately done, is basically what you're doing is you're actively activating your sense of smell by directly sniffing deliberately various scents several times a day, while you're also thinking about what the smell means. So let's say I have suntan lotion. So I can't smell, but I know I really love copper tone suntan lotion, and it reminds me of when I was going to the beach when I was a kid, etc. So I open it up, sniff it, you know, inhale, and think about that. And that as a function, and this is sort of loosey goosey, but this seems to be what's probably going on for people, that this does help. It doesn't help everybody, and it can be frustrating and tedious because it doesn't happen overnight. It can take quite a long time of this practice to get at it. But the combination of this active inhalation, which is sort of potentially activating the stem cells to sort of like get in gear again, and the cognitive like thinking connect together to make the sense of smell sort of turn back on, or at least some neurons turn back on, regain their power, etc., um, to be able to be functioning for perceiving smell. Now, that is the sort of one way that this can work, but it also, even in and of itself, what's interesting about smell training is it has a lot of positive spin-off for cognition in general. So people who have a functioning sense of smell, but as they get older, we tend to, what happens with the sense of smell in terms of aging and loss is this turnover of like, we're constantly regenerating new sensory neurons starts faltering so that we're losing neurons, but we're not regenerating them to the same extent. And so over time, and it can be very gradual and basically unnoticeable often to the person until they can be actually completely without smell. And then they don't even necessarily know that. And they're just adding, let's say, more condiments to food. And it's sort of accidental sometimes that they find out that they really can't smell at all. But in any case, if we sort of start going to the nose gym every day and deliberately sniff, not only does that actually help keep the healthy integrity of our sense of smell going, that actually does really sort of stave off this sort of aging related decline, but it also really helps our brain. So from the point of view of cognitive function, so it's not just I'm just, sniffing and then moving along. I'm sniffing and thinking. And that action, even if it's just a couple of seconds together, helps our cognitive wherewithal and keeps our cognition. It actually can forestall dementia. It can be helpful for even like, early stages of developing dementia to try to sort of stop that and not have it progress to sort of damaging levels. So it can be really important for just general mental health as we age, and not just the cognitive strength. So like I can still remember things, but also because of it's being connected to emotion, just having emotional regulation in our lives as a function of active sniffing, just in and of itself can be a very powerful thing to do. So forgetting about the smell as making me feel happy or wistful or transported, just smelling is like emotionally regulating.
Oh my God. I am so I have a million things to say and ask. And what's amazing is every single thing that you're saying, like I get so many visuals with it the whole time. I'm always getting visuals with it. I want to mention because I want to bring this to kind of like a current experience out there regarding well-being and regarding Gen Z and all the generations, because I really am excited about the connection of the multi-generational connection, right? And I see a lot at fragrance events, big events where people of all ages and a very diverse audience are actually coming to smell, talk about experience. And we're talking 14-year-old boys, to, 80-year-olds. It's really phenomenal, and the discussions that are happening about it. And I know that, one, a lot of things that I look back on my capstone regarding aromatherapy and some of your research on aromatherapy. And it's very easy to fall into lavender does this and whatnot. When I'm hearing you talk right now, I'm really hearing the experience of the actually having the mind work with it, smell it, the dimensionality of the experience of the scent itself, whether it's of a really complex fragrance or something very simple. We're not leaning into one thing. We're just experiencing, taking the time with it, and letting more than just our sense of smell activate. It's connecting body, mind, soul. It's really using it as a way in, as a lead in to the story. And I just find that really fascinating, particularly after we've been separated from technology, we've been separated from COVID, social media separated, and it feels like this is such a great avenue to start really using it as a tool, just a tool in our toolbox to reconnect.
So I love that you said this, and I love that you brought up like the storytelling and the sort of verbal component of it, because what is so I think amazing about smell is that it can be experienced purely sensorially without language. And so, unlike, for instance, I look at something and I immediately have a label for it. I might not have the right label, but I call it something or other. I hear something, it is X. We can experience scent and not have any linguistic connection to it. It can just be it. And as a function of that, I definitely think it takes us out of our analytical verbal state of being, which is what we're constantly in. Even we don't necessarily even intend to. It's just like the talk in our brain, the way that we are organizing the world around us. It is how we operate as humans. There's nothing wrong with that. But smell can exist purely in scentscape. And that can be, I think, transformative if we sort of feel it and appreciate it and get into it, as opposed to the natural tendency of, well, what is it? Now I have to find what it is. I have to put the label on it. I have
Yeah,
to
yeah.
get out of the feeling and the sensory to the thing and the analytical. And so I think this is a great opportunity to sort of really take a step inwards, to not be connected, like to be purely, completely disconnected, and even from the natural way that our brains work.
Yeah, that is, I mean, when I, the experience, if you're in a perfumery, perfumology in near guy at in Philadelphia, his store was, we were just there recently, and it's like all these people in there were really, it's like they're so comfortable being right where they are, right? They're not trying, they're not in, this is a generalization, but my experience is they are just taking in that fragrance. They're just experiencing it, and they don't necessarily have words for it, and they don't have to answer to somebody else. They're not feeling as though they have to now be a perfume expert on what that fragrance is and all the different notes and the pyramid and the accords. That's not what's happening. It's that they're just taking it in, right?
Mm.
And and I'm just looking at the time and all, but you have some relatively recent research on what somebody might give up for their sense. You give up their sense of smell for what? It's like, do you give up money or your sense of smell? Do you give up your dog, your hair, or whatever that is? I'm wondering even now if that story's changed a little bit. And also, I can't help but think about AI when you talk about data, because AI is everything data and scent is everything not data. It's simply not. And so that's the human element versus the mechanical, that element, and social media, and the experience of talking about things. But really, where I'm trying to go with this, Rachel, is again, this fragrance, scent, smell as a tool in our toolbox for reconnecting, where we actually really start to connect again. And it's not saying we throw away AI. No way. We don't throw away social media, none of that. But we actually start building up our sense of connection, both individually and as a society.
Well, digitized scent is coming, and I think that having it be part of our computer virtual landscape will be a mechanism through which we can, and I really do think the doorway through which we will be able to really reconnect. Like you and I are virtually communicating right now, but if we had smell, like if you were smelling something and I was smelling the same thing, that would bring us together in a really different way.
Hmm.
And it would potentially change our dialogue, even just having the same smell in the room while we're having this conversation. So that being said, so what you said about, losing things and trading things for smell, has it gotten better? No, it's gotten worse. So, I did this study that I collected the data in the spring of 2021, when sort of the height of everything media, everything, COVID, and smell loss. It was really, front and foremost. Everyone knew that it was a symptom and a signal and all kinds of things like that, and it was terrible, and there were these big New York Times Magazine articles and so forth. It was all over the place. And I did this study with about 400 individuals, half of whom were college students, so not necessarily reading the New York Times, but out in the world and knowing what was happening with COVID, definitely. And then also with what I call the 40 somethings, like the real adults, and looked at how they value their sense of smell compared to vision and hearing, and also various common commodities. And what my favorite example actually is the cell phone comparison. So the sort of shocking headline from the study where the data was collected in 21 was that 25% of college students would rather give up their sense of smell than their cell phone. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Here you have this thing that a lot of that generation is even saying, I wish I were born before cell phones. I mean, at least there's a little bit of that angst in there, but apparently, so 25%, I thought that was terrible. But then again, there was not a study done in 2018, so I didn't have a benchmark to know, like, now it's actually better than it was before. But a colleague of mine at Brown just asked his class of 200 and something students, that particular question, would you rather lose your sense of smell or your cell phone? And over 40% of his students said they would rather give up their sense of smell than their cell phone. So there was this brief moment where
Oh my
25%
gosh.
was actually good. I mean, this isn't
Wow.
published, but like it was just like, a little assay of where people are now. I thought 25% was bad, but actually it's seems like people really do, and this is because people don't have an understanding of what would be missing if they didn't have it. Because we are so visual, we're like, oh, if I became blind, it would be
Yeah.
horrible. But people really don't understand, because another thing about smell is attention to smelling really changes how we experience smell. So we can smell more, we can smell better when we're paying attention to sniffing the rose than if we're just like, passing by the rose bush. And so being aware is part of this whole equation of sort of sensory mindfulness, I think.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It feels like more than ever, we need this discussion and we need to make it tangible and bring it forward. Gosh, there's so much, why you said, yeah, we could do 7 episodes of a podcast. I feel as though this is just episode 1, and I hope there are so many more. I would love to kind of, I would love to end with the narrative, because the it's still like all of the things that you've said still lean me to um meaning and mattering and the narrative, even if 40% are saying that they whatever percent would give up their sense of smell. It's to me, I read that is they're giving up a sense of their story that they don't recognize, right? So that immediately is part of their value, that they're not giving value to that part of their story. And that's what we want to do right now more than ever, is understand our own individual, why we're interesting, why our story matters, why we matter, what we bring to the table that nobody else does. And scent is such a central part of that.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, you said it perfectly. But I guess because it is such an individual experience and our individual story with smell is so varied, unless we can use smell in a way to explain to other people, to share the scent, to tell people like this is a smell, with devices, actually, I think that will be able to help with this. That I can have, let's say, I've captured the 10 scents that are my the smells that really kind of define me, whatever that might mean, in this particular moment or my life up until this moment. And then I share that with you, and then you have an understanding of that. However, your perception of those scents is going to be different than mine. One, because of the things that you bring to the table as a function of your past associations with the smell. Two, because of actually how the chemistry of those scents is being detected, physiologically by your nose. And then also by the context you're in when you're smelling it. So, for example, if I, curate this really special collection of my 10 story smells, and then I give this thing to you, so you have it with you, and you smell it in the kitchen while you're cooking, or you smell it outside while you're doing something else versus you smell it in like the clean laboratory. So you get like the perfect actual smell of these things. It's going to smell differently because of the context that you're in. It's because of the other aromas that are maybe mixing with it. Also, your mindset, even the time of day, where you are like emotionally while you're smelling these things. So my ability to convey to you my truth through smell is not going to be as literal as if I, let's say, collected 10 photographs that emblemize my life to now. And then I said, see, these things are me. Even though the emotional connection is going to be so much more powerful with smell, at least for me, your ability to really fully glean it, I don't think, I mean, it'll be something and it'll depend on lots of different things, but I think it's subject to a lot more noise. Like there could be a lot more fuzz in the way the picture comes across, as it were, than the sort of clarity of visual version of that, even if the visual version didn't have the emotional component.
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. My loves in life are certainly, scent and fragrance, but movies. My mom took us to the movies, the drive-in in the 70s, and seeing the greatest films of all time. And still today, going into a movie theater and reading a great book. And, no one experiences a great novel in the same way. No one experiences a film in the same way. And they're in a different theater. They're doing it at home now or wherever. They're at a different age in their life. They're at a different time in their life. They're under duress. They're in love, or they're whatever, on how we experience a film or read a book. And the idea of experiencing a fragrance in that way, if it's told, if the story's told with as much integrity and truth as the perfumer and creative team can muster, just bring as much integrity as a storyteller as you can, and then you let your child go, and then they go, and then everybody experiences it differently, and we experience that informs our narrative. How emotional are we in the theater? How do we experience it? That's me being informed about what my personal narrative is on how I'm reacting. I think that that's so brilliant, and it's so exciting, and I am so grateful to you because you really are the person out there that's basically saying this and speaking it, and I don't want to say preaching it, but like, thank God you're there. Thank
I'm an
goodness. And I
advocate.
hope we can do it more. You're an
Yeah.
advocate.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. What a treat. I hope you'll join me again.
Yes, definitely, Jeff. Thank you so much. This has been terrific.
Oh my gosh. What a treat. Thank you so much. Have an amazing weekend, and I can't wait to speak soon.
Smell everything wonderful.
Amazing. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.